Hello everyone! I know it's been a while. It's been about a month since my last video. As of right now, it's June 24th when I'm recording this, and I'm hoping that I'll upload this video later tonight, although we'll see if that ends up happening. I'm gonna try. But the last time I uploaded was about a month ago. I did a mini review post, and I was saying, okay, I'm getting back on track toward a regular schedule of uploading a bunch of album reviews. And that hasn't happened. It's been about a month, and here I am finally uploading more album reviews for the first time in a while. And before I get into talking about these albums, I just want to give a quick channel update. A few things I'd like to say. First of all, I'm going to be moving soon, actually tomorrow. So this is the last video you'll see on my channel with this background. Next time it'll be a different background. I don't know exactly what it'll look like, but yeah, it also means it might take a little while before I end up uploading another video. I'll admit that right now. I'm not going to say, oh, I'll have more videos very soon, because it might be a couple weeks. But that being said, I do have some plans to get back on track toward actually getting on a more regular schedule, because I want to get back to where I was of reviewing lots of albums per week or lots of albums per month and listening to a lot of the discographies of the artists who I'm reviewing. And I just haven't really been doing that. I haven't been listening to that much music the past few months. The past month or so, I've gotten back into listening to more new music, more than I was. Still not a ton, but I'm also listening to quite a bit that I'm not reviewing, and that's kind of what I'm going to be doing for the next couple weeks. I think I'll be listening to more albums. I'm not going to review every album that's going to end up on my year-end list, assuming I do end up making a top 50 albums list at the end of the year, which I really want to. But yeah, I'm not going to be able to review all of them just because that's going to take so much time. And I also don't want to just get to a point where I'm only reviewing albums that I really like. Like, I know to some extent I want to mostly prioritize those, but also if I just start reviewing albums that I really like, I don't know, it feels a little odd to me. It just feels like I'm not being as fair, even though that's not necessarily true. But on that note, I am unfortunately announcing something that I was not wanting to do. I was really hoping I was going to post all my year-end lists for 2024, but I am going to cancel my year-end list of my favorite albums and songs of 2024. I didn't want to do that. I was really hoping I'd be able to post them, and I could have tried to if I really wanted to, but I don't know. 2024 just seems so in the past at this point. I mean, most of that year I wasn't even on YouTube. It was kind of just the year where I started my YouTube channel, and I just want to focus more on making sure I can get my year-end list out for 2025. Hopefully I'll have like all the ones I plan to for 2024 in 2025. Obviously with 2025 albums, not 2024. But anyway, I think that gets everything across that I wanted to for now. Yeah, so hopefully by July, that's what I'm hoping for the second half of this year. I'm hoping that I'll be back on more of a schedule where I'm listening to more albums and reviewing albums more frequently. And yeah, we'll see what happens. I'm really hoping I can do that. But anyway, for now, I do have 5 mini album reviews. Some of these were a little bit longer. I put a little bit more effort into them. And then there were a few more that I just kind of finished up recently where I went, you know what, I just want to get enough so I can have like a mini review video of 5 albums, and I'm not really going to worry too much about putting that much detail in. So yeah, anyway, with all that being said, let's get the review started with... Alright, so this one's long overdue, and it's one that I was quite excited about. I remember really liking Spelling's first 2 albums, and I revisited them a few months ago and was reminded of the subtle ways that Spelling's music can be enchanting and really pull you into its world. But I also won't beat around the bush. When I think of Spelling, I first think of her 2021 album, The Turning Wheel, an album that received tons and tons of praise from critics at the time, and it still absolutely holds up to this day. I'm not sure there's a better word to describe that album than enchanting. The sort of album that feels like it was created in a magical world that you'd expect in a fairy tale or something. And if that sounds like a weird description to someone who hasn't heard the album, then just wait till you hear it for yourself, and you'll notice how accurate that description is. And it's got so many moments that still take my breath away to this day, including a title track which deserves a special mention of its own for being damn near perfect and capturing the feeling of bittersweetness better than anyone else could. So I had good reason to be excited about Portrait of My Heart, and, well, I'm not going to say it's better than The Turning Wheel, but it is still a pretty great album. And I actually really appreciate the shift toward a more straightforward alternative rock sound in a lot of these moments. Even though compared to the crafty eccentricity of The Turning Wheel, it isn't as memorable and probably won't stand out as much in the grander scheme of things. In other words, this does in a lot of ways feel like a transitional album, and I'm very curious to hear what Spelling does next after this. I have good reasons to expect greatness. But while this packs some great tunes, I wouldn't recommend going into this expecting to be blown away. But let's start by talking about the production, which is part of the reason why this works so well. And I like how this album has simultaneously a very clean and also grimy sound. And it's a paradox that might only make sense to my own unique set of ears, which isn't nearly as credible as those with actual music production knowledge, but the elements of this project that bring the real visceral punch have enough grit from the production choices that it makes this project easier to really feel rather than just admire, while simultaneously the vocals remain very pretty, as do a lot of the cleaner synth and guitar timbres. And I think it helps us have more replay value, even though some of it might be due to a bias from my expectation being more of that latter vibe that I mentioned. I'm not really sure. But either way, the prettiness makes it a little easier to feel pulled back to, even though there's a lot more packed into this 40-minute album. And most of these tracks have a lot of firepower, which brings me to discussing the melodies and compositions. And I think this album has a lot of really strong choruses, probably even more than The Turning Wheel did. I love the way Keep It Alive keeps the tension going with what sounds like it's going to resolve and then ends up pulling you into that haunting guitar loop. Alibi feels like the sort of song that would have been on The Turning Wheel in every way except for the very noticeable change in musical style. It's borderline pop-punk, and I wasn't expecting that from Spelling at all. And even though I don't totally love the opening title track, I do like how the strings complement the chorus quite well, and that's just to name a few really solid hooks on this project. I think a big part of this album's appeal for me is about how the whole album experience goes together, and it's kind of hard to figure out why, especially when you consider the songs all seem very different thematically. Yeah, there is some overlap between songs, like how the first two tracks both seem to be about self-doubt and trying to escape a seemingly eternal struggle, and the simple on the surface but open to interpretation lyrical style where overthinking it and or taking it at surface level are all valid options. Well, that is something that continues throughout the album pretty consistently in my opinion. But it doesn't feel like there's a consistent storyline or theme throughout the album, especially when you consider songs like Mount Analog, which seems to be about a relationship where something feels a bit off, or more straightforward love songs like Love Ray Eyes or Ammunition, the latter of which might be the best song in this album with such a great, grimy force propelled by the guitar distortion and pounding drums that are absolutely delicious. And I feel a similar way about Drain sonically, although it's much darker lyrically, showing a narrator who's been mistreated, causing self-hatred that is used to get revenge without that self-love coming back, or maybe just coming back in a different form, loving the villainous self, which can be justified depending on the circumstances, but it's not pretty to acknowledge. Oh yeah, and then the album ends with a really unnecessary My Bloody Valentine cover, although at least the mixing is better, thus making it better than the original in my opinion. Yeah, I'm one of those people who thinks that Loveless doesn't have very good mixing, I know. Anyway, Spelling's singing remains fantastic on this album. The music is simultaneously pretty and rough in the best ways, and while I'm not totally blown away by the songwriting all the time, it's still very impressive how consistently this album remains at least interesting, and most of it is really pleasant to listen to. So I'll give this at least a light 8 out of 10. It's not better than The Turning Wheel, but I still absolutely think it's worth a shot. So this took a while for me to get to, but a few months ago when it came out, I did go back and listen to Deafheaven's other albums, all of which I'd heard before, but not for a while. And man, this is one of the weirder bands I've listened to this year. And that's mostly because after making 4 legit black metal albums, in 2021, they suddenly went shoegaze or some kind of 80s pop-esque genre on Infinite Granite, their 2021 album, and it easily resulted in their weakest album to date, in my opinion. And it's not because of the shift in genre, it's just that the production didn't really work for me, and the hooks weren't really there, and it just felt like it was trying too hard to be something that it wasn't. They felt like they couldn't decide where they wanted to go with it stylistically. Anyway, I heard this new album was apparently a return to form for the band, not only in terms of sound, but also quality, as this is easily one of the most acclaimed albums of 2025 thus far. So I was actually really excited to hear it, and well, yeah, for good reason. Because this is probably the most I've liked a Deafheaven album to date, and surprisingly it actually has a lot of the elements that Infinite Granite did, with the cleaner guitars and vocals in a lot of the moments here, and the sudden shifts to black metal passages. Albeit with writing that's a lot more interesting and much better production in my opinion. All of this makes me both more and less surprised when I saw that the two albums have the same producer, Justin Meldal Johnson. I just think he did a much better job this time. But this doesn't surprise me either, because he's been really hit or miss for me, and I mean that in a good and bad way, not just in a bad way. That's what I mean when I say hit or miss. Anyway, there is certainly a lot to like about this new Deafheaven album beyond just the improvement in production, including a lot of the really well-written lyrics, not only in moments like Heathen, which seems to describe someone with a fear of intimacy, or the heartbreaking closing track that shows someone losing a battle to an illness which could represent many different things, but even more striking moments such as Doberman, where the narrator realizes he's created his own problems, had ways to escape them, and yet didn't, and finds himself in a horrific mess mentally. Don't ask why this resonates with me. And Body Behavior has some vivid storytelling of a father figure prying to find out about the narrator's taste in women, and it's both funny and also devastatingly real. And yet there are so many striking lines throughout this album, which I'll just let you discover for yourself, partially because I'm lazy and don't really feel like writing a full review. And sonically, there's a lot of really strong moments as well, like the haunting guitar melody that bursts into madness on Amethyst, or the jumpy guitars with a lot of groove on Revelator, a song that also goes into a haunting mellow section toward the end before getting insanely heavy again. And that leads into one of the most driving grooves on the album in Body Behavior, which is arguably my favorite track on the album, although it is certainly close. There's a few that could contend for that. Look, I wish I could go more in depth here, but that would take more time, and I don't really want to spend all that much time on this right now, but I do recommend you give this album a shot, because it's the kind of emotionally hard-hitting black metal that you don't come across often. It's well-produced, full of great melodies, and really shows this band reaching their potential in my opinion. Only time will tell how much this sticks for me, but for now I feel confident giving it an 8 out of 10. I'm not sure it completely lives up to the hype, but it's certainly close. So this is the second Turnstile album that I've listened to after their 2021 album Glow On, which became a part of my semi-regular rotation. It was a really fun blend of punk rock with some poppier elements as well, and they have continued to do more of the same on this new album, with even some sort of ambient elements as well. But for the most part, this is kind of more of the same as what we got in Glow On, except I think I might actually like this a little bit more. I mean, time will tell whether or not I end up going back to this much, but I do really like a lot of the lyrics on this album about embracing yourself and accepting things as they are, although it's not without lots of paranoia and doubt. And this album is also just a lot of fun to listen to. I'm not totally sure the hooks are as memorable as songs like Holiday or Blackout from Glow On, but the production is still punchy as hell and there are lots of great guitar moments. And I love how hard-hitting the drums are, especially on songs like Soul, Slowdive, Sun Shower, Look Out For Me, and Dreaming, the latter of which has some awesome horns in it as well. Now, this does bring me to mentioning the fact that some of these songs do feel like they're trying to emulate tracks from Glow On, such as how Soul feels like a remake of Endless, and I wouldn't say it's as great a version of that song, although this one does still go pretty hard. And Sun Shower's vocal delivery is quite reminiscent of Mystery. But really, I think that all makes sense, especially considering the point of this album seems to be doubling down on what made the previous album work so well. And even with such unique moments like the trippy passages on Look Out For Me, remember the album is called Never Enough. No matter what this band does or how much of the same style of music they put out, people are going to want more. And ironically, it ends up satisfying me probably more than their previous album. That irony was probably intentional. So yeah, I think I like this more than Glow On as a whole. I'm not sure its best moments are as strong as that album's best, but I think it's more consistently great. Really, the consistency of this album is what impresses me the most. Not every song is super memorable, but they might end up that way if I listen to this enough, and pretty much all of them go really hard. So I guess I gotta give this an 8 out of 10. Really good stuff. More than 5 years after Addison Rae first blew up on TikTok, she's now finally released her debut studio album, and my only memory of her music career up to this point was Obsessed back in 2021, which I didn't like at the time and I still don't like to this day, and the critics mostly agree. Which is why I was surprised to see how much acclaim Addison has been getting for singles this year, like Diet Pepsi, Aquamarine, High Fashion, and Headphones On. But the album didn't get as much acclaim as those singles would imply. Still, I had fairly high expectations, at least that this would have some strong standouts. And it feels weird saying I'm disappointed by this new Addison Rae album being merely decent, because as someone who had only heard Obsessed going into this year, I would not have expected any level of quality from a new Addison Rae album. But with Elvira Anderfjord and Luca Closer behind the production, neither of whom's production I was familiar with before this, the instruments actually complement each other quite well, and Addison Rae's vocals stand out quite well in the mix, that is when she's not drenched in effects on High Fashion, which is probably the weakest song here, because of the underwhelming hook and annoying synth timbres as well as the vocal production that I just mentioned. But even in other moments here that I don't think totally work, I can still applaud the creativity to some extent. Money Is Everything is certainly a very unique song. I'm not sure I've heard anything like it, even though I don't particularly like that song a whole lot. And on a sort of similar note, Fame Is a Gun is easily one of the catchiest songs here, and it's one of those rare songs that I don't think is particularly good, or at least it shouldn't be, and yet I like it a lot. I mean, there's nothing unique or special about this Charlie XCX wannabe attempt, and the production is a mess. Not usually a problem on this album, by the way. And yet I actually think this might be my favorite song here. It's too much of an earworm. And then there's Diet Pepsi, which is also one of the catchier songs here, and it's been stuck in my head nonstop, and I'm not complaining, because it's a pretty great song with some of the best production here. I can also compliment the production of Aquamarine, and Summer Forever sounds like a much better version of early Lana Del Rey. But I don't know, I kind of expected this album to stand out a little bit more to me, maybe be a little bit more consistent and have more bops. Because while I think this is pretty good, and I'll give it a strong 6 out of 10, I don't think I'll be going back to this much outside of Diet Pepsi, Fame Is a Gun, and maybe Times Like These, the latter because I relate to the lyrics more than I'd like to admit. And even then, I'll say that song is not all that special and really gets by on the mood it captures more than anything. So for me, if I'm still underwhelmed, that is not a good sign. Still, if you're looking for a simple pop album with some catchy tunes, this might be worth a shot. Just don't expect much more than that. I will call it a good album, but it's far from great. Alright, so here's an album I was highly anticipating, albeit it's one of those cases where I'm not excited for the album itself as much as I am excited to have an opinion on it and review it. Because make no mistake, Sleep Token have become without a doubt one of my favorite bands to talk about, even though I've never really considered myself that much of a fan. And in large part it's because of the really mixed reception that they've gotten from critics. In fact, that's the main reason, although there are other reasons as well. I recently revisited their first 2 albums for the first time in a while, and I've just never been able to get into them. I think my favorite opinion I've ever heard about them is from Mark Grondin of Spectrum Pulse, one of my favorite YouTubers, who has said that they make metalcore by way of Bastille. And ever since I heard him say that, I've never been able to unhear it. The lead singer's voice just sounds so much like Dan Smith, and it really just feels like the same kind of music. Well, not the same kind of music, but it feels like the same sort of songwriting style, where for the most part it just feels like the songs aren't really going anywhere, except it's metalcore. Now, to Sleep Token's credit, their best songs are leagues above anything Bastille have ever done. But that's about as far as I'll go to give them the edge in that comparison, because their music has that same feeling of trying to convince you that there's way more to it than there actually is. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe it actually is deep, I'll say that about both bands. But personally, I've never been able to get into the lore around Sleep Token, just like with 21 Pilots. I just look at what's right there in front of me, not all the added program music-esque context that goes with it, but isn't there in the actual art. Or even if it is in the actual art, again, I don't really understand how the lore even works. It just isn't resonating with me like that. And while 21 Pilots have a tendency to at least make songs that resonate with me emotionally and typically don't have particularly low lows, Sleep Token, even at their best, are kind of a tricky band to fully praise as much as I'd like to. And this brings us to 2023's Take Me Back to Eden, which is a very fascinating album to me for multiple reasons, the biggest being that I'm not sure I've ever seen a more divided set of opinions on an album. It felt like that album was making so many best albums of 2023 lists, and also so many worst albums of 2023 lists. I guess it felt that way because that is what happened, and there were also quite a few people who were somewhere in between on it, but it seemed like for the most part, people either loved it or they thought it sucked. But also another part of the reason why I'm so fascinated by it is because I ended up somewhere in the middle, where it didn't make my top 50 albums of that year and wouldn't in retrospect either, but I also didn't think it was nearly as bad as its biggest critics did. In fact, there were 2 songs on that project which I absolutely loved and still love to this day, even though I think the album is very messy as a whole project and has some very noticeable low points. And one of those 2 songs that I loved was the one that everyone hated, even the fans of the album. Yes, that one. I said it. It might even be my favorite Sleep Token song. And now to find a distraction from me sharing that very contentious opinion, let's talk about this new Sleep Token album, which shows them experimenting with the widest variety of genres that they have probably on any album thus far. And unfortunately, I also think it's their weakest to date. This is the first album where I've actually fully understood why people hate Sleep Token so much, and the worst part is that it's kind of making me understand the hate for their previous albums more than I ever have. That's not to say I don't still like Take Me Back to Eden, but I'm starting to understand the hate when I didn't before. And it's hard to fully explain, but I think the best way I can put it is that on this album, it seems like Sleep Token don't know what they're trying to do. And part of me thinks they're trying to make a more mainstream album in the pop music world while also bringing metalcore elements to try and get that genre more mainstream attention from a pop crowd. And if that is what they're trying to do, it's definitely working. But this also isn't particularly new for this band, and it doesn't really fit artistically. I'm not saying these genres can't be blended together well. I mean, look at Spirit Box, who I just reviewed last week, and I've been a fan of them for years. And I think the best way I can put it is that Spirit Box are pretty much a pop band disguised as a metal band. And as someone who likes both genres, I've always appreciated their ability to take the appeal of both genres and integrate it together to make some of the most accessible metalcore you could imagine. And also Spirit Box are Spirit Box. There's much more I could say to describe why I like them so much, including personal reasons that their music resonates with me. But Sleep Token, on the other hand, often sound like they're just trying to make more challenging music without actually branching out into particularly interesting ideas. In other words, instead of embracing their genre crossovers, they seem to be more focused on trying to invent a new style, which I don't think flatters them or their lead singer Vessel the majority of the time. Now, I don't want to spend too much time going over the ways this might change my perspective on the peculiar critical reception of Take Me Back to Eden. This is a mini review, so I guess it's time to talk about Even In Arcadia, which shows the band's biggest display of genres to date, including the usual metalcore elements you get in a Sleep Token album, albeit more embarrassingly dull than ever. But we also get a lot more pop elements than usual for this band, the typical R&B elements, and even reggaeton on Caramel. Yeah, I still can't believe that song exists. And I won't mince words, Sleep Token do a terrible job of blending genres on this album. Never before have Vessel's vocals sounded more out of place on a Sleep Token album, and while bad production absolutely plays a part in the huge anthemic rock moments not having any impact, the bad setups and lack of anticipation for said moments also does not help one bit. And that's one of the most frustrating things about this album. Even some of the moments that could have gone fairly hard just feel really underwhelming and don't have a lot of impact at all for me. A prime example of this being the opener, Look to Windward, which is actually one of the better songs on this album, but while I do sort of like the build-up with the repetition and the strings, the sudden burst of metal screaming and chugging guitars feels way too out of pocket, and it's not helped by the drums feeling so underpowered by the production. And that's before this track goes into a really weird R&B pop section where Vessel's vocals and the percussion make for a really awkward juxtaposition. And I feel kind of similarly about the following track, Emergence, which I didn't like as a single and I don't like it on the album. This track is almost entirely a dull slog that offers little to nothing, but even when there is the occasional good melody, it's bogged down by production that doesn't flatter this kind of music at all. And from that point on, I don't even know what's worth analyzing. Yeah, I could try, but at the end of the day, most of this can be summed up by describing an album that thinks it's way deeper and more interesting than it actually is. Because beyond the very surface level moodiness of a song like the title track or Provider, you realize you've basically just been listening to a Bastille song, except there's a bit more musical heaviness, which, once again, doesn't actually go that hard. And then you get a track like Gethsemane, which sounds like it's trying to emulate Euclid, the closer from Take Me Back to Eden, but the jumpy instrumentation is really awkward and the vocals are definitely not one of Vessel's stronger performances. I think the best song on the album is actually the closing track, Infinite Baths, because it doesn't feel like it's trying to be more than it is. As a result, it's a pretty good song, and that's about it. And look, to some extent, I get what Sleep Token are trying to do here. There seems to be a slight story arc on this album where even though I don't fully understand all the lore, I can pick up parts of what they're trying to convey, like the feeling of trying to move on from your past self and experiences, but continuing to get pulled back even when you know you shouldn't, and searching for some sense of stability. And unfortunately, it all feels either very surface level or disguised in wordy writing that doesn't really bring any new perspectives to the table. Now, I can acknowledge this is just the way I see it, and maybe I just didn't put the time and effort in, but I know when an album feels like it should resonate with me. This is one of those cases, and yet it doesn't, for all the reasons I've mentioned thus far. So for me, this is a 4 out of 10, easily my least favorite Sleep Token album to date, and while I could recommend the experience if you're really curious, I think you got better things to do with your time. At least I certainly did. Alright, thank you for watching. As always, these are all just my personal opinions on these albums. I may say some things like they're objective, but really it is all subjective at the end of the day. If my delivery seemed a little off today, I've been having really bad allergies. I really just wanted to get this filmed today because I'm about to head out the door, and this is my last day living in this apartment where I am right now, so I kind of wanted to do one more video with this background. But yeah, with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. I'll try and get back on track soon with a more consistent review schedule, but I think for the rest of June, I'm going to try and get caught up on maybe a few more of the albums that I missed. I might not review all of them, but anyway, yeah, in July, I'm going to try and get back to a more regular reviewing schedule. We'll see if that happens, but that's the goal. Thank you for watching. I will see you all soon.